All right, this is the Brandon Adams podcast, episode 3. My guest needs no introduction. It's Nate Silver. I'm going to use this opportunity to really dig into presidential betting odds because although we talk often, I don't get a chance to really dig into this stuff. So at the moment, Trump is 42% in the betting markets. I guess we should open the conversation by talking about the predictive power of betting markets in general and saying, has anything changed there? Do we have reason to think betting markets have become better or worse predictors? And what do we think in general about the predictive power of betting markets?
So you mean political betting markets in particular? Or
Yes.
I don't think political betting markets are terribly impressive. If you look at their performance, they perform roughly as well as models do, as published public models do, which in some sense I think people are like, oh, these are just as good as like 538's predictions. In some sense, like that's actually very damning to like the prediction markets, right? If you can take publicly available data and you cannot improve on it, then it suggests that you're not adding very much value by aggregating different forecasts or by adding subjective whatever, etc. So I think it's a very different situation than say sports betting, where the markets are more liquid, where the markets are more sophisticated, where people I think are less emotionally inclined. And I think these markets like often kind of reflect the political biases of the traders, because there's not enough money involved. The structures are sometimes a little bit awkward. I don't know why, right? But I think they're like, I mean, so that's as compared to like the 538 model or other kind of statistical ways of forecasting elections, as compared to like classic punditry, they're probably a lot better, right? Like I'd rather kind of like listen to a prediction market than the panel on Morning Joe or something. But politics is funny. I think there are a lot of people who have kind of a sophomoric knowledge of elections, where they know kind of a few things and not a lot of things. And oftentimes in any market, if you know a few things and not a lot of things, then you can be kind of the sucker in the market potentially. So my priors are like, you know, are not terribly positive as an empirical matter on how well they do. But I think if you had more capitalization, right? I mean, you also have questions about like how efficient are like markets in general, right? So you have all the problems and all the advantages that you would have with regular types of markets, but I think there are unique reasons why political markets tend to underperform a little bit.
Well, I would guess based on my own observations that you would have done well in betting markets trading based on the 538 predictions, especially during the last election. But some of the problems you point out with betting markets, I think might have to do with the fact that people in betting markets are very impatient. And if you look at observed data in betting, most of the bets happen now either in game or just before the game. Mm-hmm. So people like to get their entertainment fix immediately. Yeah. And they typically only have enough money in their betting account to fund like this week's bets. They don't really like those bets that have to wait a year or a year and a half. And I think that's been a big problem with the betting markets. And in particular, that affects the betting markets on, say, some of the long shots that people might really care to get information about, say like a Buttigieg or something like this. The odds, because someone who was betting for or against them is or someone who wants to lay is risking a lot of money and having to tie it up for a long period of time, you don't get an accurate representation.
Yeah, or Andrew Yang is one where there have been times when recently when Andrew Yang was rated as the third most likely nominee, more likely than Bernie Sanders, more likely than Kamala Harris, which I think is, at 538, we probably provide more coverage of Yang than most mainstream news outlets, but I think, he's not more likely to win the nomination than Bernie Sanders, for example. And I think that reflects the fact that he's kind of like someone who a lot of like people who are in the betting markets would like, right? He's kind of a tech bro and kind of like different and like an outsider, right? He talks about math all the time, and so it's hard to look at that and not think there's some bias. But you're right. There's also like an aspect of like technical trading where if you can anticipate changes in the conventional wisdom, right, then you can probably make money in the interim. And I actually think that it's often very, very obvious when the media is ready to change the narrative of the race in ways that probably don't actually affect like the underlying kind of fundamentals of the race very much at all, right? But like, it's pretty obvious. It was pretty obvious before the Elizabeth Warren surge that the media was kind of pining for a Elizabeth Warren surge and was kind of promoting polls that showed her doing well, and eventually she actually was doing well, right? It's obvious right now as we're recording this that like the media is ready for like a change in the narrative. They want Mayor Pete to come back. They want maybe Bernie to come back. I don't know, right? They want Amy Klobuchar to do well, and so you could like, if you can anticipate like kind of what market sentiment is, which I think is actually fairly predictable in some ways, then maybe you're right to hold Warren at 40 when she should be 30 because she'll go to 50, right? And so I've never kind of looked at that part of it. I know the kind of final end predictions are they're good, but they're not particularly insightful. They don't seem to add a lot of value relative to publicly available models.
So speaking on narrative, I remember after the early debate where Harris attacked Biden and was a little bit of a media darling, she surged in the betting markets, and then there's been a fairly intense reversal where she's now rated very, very poorly by the betting markets. So right now we have Hillary has a piece of the betting markets at 2.5%. Is there any meaning there? Is that
I don't I don't think people should assume that these markets reflect inside information. And the reason why is if you cover the campaign, I do not participate in political betting markets. If you cover the campaign, there are times when you learn about campaign developments before they're made public, because a lot of stuff is embargoed, right? If a new poll is going to come out from another news organization, some news organizations want all the other journalists, other places to get that poll, because that poll, they want people to write about it, right? And if you know what the poll's going to say in advance, you can write a story about it and feature it more prominently. Or you might know if a candidate's going to enter the race or drop out, or you might know news that like is not yet public, right? And I have not seen very many times when the markets correctly pick up on the inside information that you have access to as a journalist. And so that means that there aren't very many journalists apparently who are trying to participate in markets. And it means that like, I don't know, I think people have this kind of magic belief in markets that kind of derives from places where markets just are more sophisticated and more liquid, kind of, 80% of the stuff. I don't know sports betting markets as well as you do, right? Maybe I'm in the sophomoric stage there, but like my impression is that like, 80% of the time, or 80% of the things I'm saying about political betting markets might not apply to like sports betting markets. Although it does seem like, I don't know, sometimes like is this true that like in sports betting markets are really kind of high profile events more likely to be mispriced? The Super Bowl or the final of the US Open?
I don't think so, but it's a debatable topic. Certainly there have been times when the Super Bowl has appeared mispriced and a lot of the sharp money has been on one side. That sharp money hasn't always been right, but there are people that believe that Super Bowls tend to be mispriced. I don't know if it's true in general. And as you point out, markets are very predictive. There's reasons to think that sports betting markets are more predictive than, say, financial markets, because in sports betting markets, there's nothing illegal about trading on inside information. Obviously, it's illegal to trade on a fixed match, but there's nothing illegal about trading on information that only you have. So we would, and that one person who has the information can fully determine price if they want to. So there's reason to expect that these markets are even more efficient. The political betting markets would fall under that. In 2016, the political betting markets, even at this stage, were much bigger than they are now. And there was reason to expect that maybe political betting markets would be the next thing and they would get bigger and bigger and more efficient. But this year, they seem to be kind of small, which I think explains some of their apparent inefficiency.
Yeah, and I don't know why that is exactly. I mean, look, these markets have had some high profile misses, certainly, right? I don't know if that's hurt the reputation or what, right? I mean, if anything, if you were a trader, you might say these markets are stupid, therefore I'm more likely to participate, right? Certainly Brexit, where all the UK bookmakers had odds overwhelmingly against Brexit occurring, even though the polls basically showed it tied. That was not a terribly brilliant performance for the betting market. Some other kind of European elections, right? I think conversely in the French election, they had like Marie Le Pen priced way too high, I think is kind of a counter reaction. The markets were, in the view of 538 model, a little bit low on Trump, although the markets were kind of at least within the right order of magnitude, so to speak, right? They had Trump at, I think 15 to 18% on election day to win. We had him at 29%. I think the average reporter at the New York Times had him at, if you asked them to estimate, probably have him at 5%. And I think if you look at other models, some models had him as low as 1%. That is one thing about political modeling in general is like, I guess this is true of other domains as well. But it's way easier to have a really dumb and bad model in politics. In part because, like, first of all, American elections are complicated in that you have a bunch of contests taking place all together, right? So you have, in the congressional elections, you have 435 House races plus roughly 35 Senate races that take place on the same day every year, and all those races are correlated. In the Electoral College, you have people say it's 50 separate contests. It's not really. It's one contest that manifests itself in 50 states in the District of Columbia, and errors in the forecast are correlated. So one reason why 538 had Trump at 29 or 30% and not at 2% is because it was not a surprise that Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania all slipped away from Clinton because those are all kind of like the same types of states, right? White working class voters in those states, Midwestern states. There's nothing magic that happens when you cross the state line from Wisconsin to Michigan, except people root for a different football team. And so therefore, if you have the actual structure encoded correctly, where you understand that errors in the forecast are correlated, that's the big reason why Trump winning was not such an upset, right? If people say, well, he'd have to win this state where he's down 3 points, this state where he's down 2, and this state where he's down 3, maybe he'll win one of them, but you flip a coin 3 times and it would have to come up heads all 3 times. Like, no, it's exactly the wrong way to think about it, right? It's like you flip a coin that like has one toss basically, and you have 3 manifestations that are a result of that toss.
So as an outsider to political prediction, one difference that I notice is that if you're talking about, say, the NBA Finals, people are trying to come up with their best estimates that the Raptors win, and they're not emotional about it. They might be wrong in their probability assessments, but they're just trying to come up with a probability assessment. Whereas in politics, I think if you're involved in political prediction, there's no space for emotion or what you want to happen. But I noticed that in that world in general, there's a lot of emotion, and it seems to flavor both the modeling and the discussion.
No, for sure. I mean, I think, the biggest advantage to 538 or to me of having a model is that like it kind of serves as protection for when you get yourself emotionally invested in the election, right? One thing about our politics models is kind of once we release it in the summer, we don't make subjective adjustments to it, right? It says what it says, and I'll make one exception. In the first week or two after we release it, then we always kind of learn things about how it might be behaving like in a buggy way, right? So it's kind of like the rule, if you drop food on the floor, you can like give 3 seconds to pick it up and eat it, right? It's kind of like we drop a model, we'll give ourselves a couple of days or maybe a week or two where it's kind of in beta mode, and we'll make fixes to it. Because no matter how much you like whiteboard a model or obviously backtest, then there are always things you learn when it's performing on new data in real time. But we're very strict on the politics side about like, if we think it's doing something wrong, then we will keep a note of that and then change it next time around. Because people do get very invested and emotional in politics. It's not just a matter of like rooting for a candidate you might prefer. There are other types of biases too, right? If you kind of bought into a certain narrative early on, right? If you had been someone that early on thought, oh, I really don't think Elizabeth Warren has any shot or whatever, right? Well, that might color your perception of the rest of the campaign potentially, and that might make you emotionally like tilted a little bit if she starts to do well. You might have interest in, I don't know, maybe you have economic interest in one candidate. Oh, that's maybe more rational, right? One candidate doing well for your tax bracket or whatever. But yeah, I think kind of politics kind of fries people's brains a lot, and people are kind of so used to making arguments in a case where they're trying to be adversarial about it, right? Where you're not trying to like present the most objective case, you're trying to present the most persuasive case, and those things are often different and even somewhat opposite, right? And so kind of just the types of, I don't know, right? Types of thinking people use when they're covering politics. I think it's like, you guys have read Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, right? Talks about like system 1 and system 2, and system 1 is kind of fast, reactive thinking, right? Which is necessary in your day-to-day life, right? If I'm riding a bike to the studio, then I'm just kind of totally in system 1, watching for cars and pedestrians doing stupid things, right? And oftentimes the reactions in politics where Trump tweets something and you're like, oh my God, that's outrageous, right? It's a kind of system 1 reaction. And Trump in particular is trying to trigger, I think, system 1 reflexes about immigrants or whatever else, right? Whereas to cover an election campaign, you really need the opposite of that. You need system 2, slower, more deliberate thinking. You need to be very patient. You need to like actually, like, I don't think you actually need to be a contrarian, but you need to like learn to deeply, deeply discount the conventional wisdom almost to zero. And it's kind of hard for most people to do intuitively. I mean, notwithstanding the fact that like, if most people believe something, then statistically you're probably one of the people who believes it, right? So, I can kind of tell when I really kind of, not just for betting purposes, we often, we cover the campaign, we have a podcast about it, we have, tweet about it, we write articles about it, right? So I can tell like when you kind of really pick up on like a under-examined piece of the conventional wisdom, a kind of assumption that's baked in that people aren't even aware that they're bringing an assumption to the table, right? The ones that really bother people are the ones where you probably actually have the most insight, right? Because of the unexamined premises that people have.
Yeah. Now, I'm curious, in this election, we talked about how the betting markets seem to be somewhat dead, but the financial markets are starting to really wake up to the election. Is there any way to bring in financial market behavior into political prediction? Because there are some sectors that would obviously be hit harder, like biotechnology. And maybe the relative performance of biotech to the index might tell you something about the election probabilities.
Yeah, classically, healthcare stocks or defense stocks. I mean, one thing we have always thought about doing and never done, but yeah, could you create like a basket of stocks, basically, where they indicate the market sentiment about the election? I mean, you could do it empirically, like kind of retrospectively say, okay, well, which commodities or which equities were most correlated with movement in political betting markets or the 538 forecast or whatever else. I'm sure you could kind of back out something, but yeah, I mean, it's a cool project for someone. A free idea for someone is like, figure out some way to figure out which stocks are most sensitive to the election, because that's where the real money would be made or lost, right? It's partly why people are like, oh my gosh, people are gambling thousands of dollars on predict it. It's like, okay, like, I'm sorry, but like, that's not very much money. And you would risk millions or tens of millions of dollars if you were like a hedge fund and you thought you actually had like a value added prediction, even though, I mean, yeah, there's some noise you're picking up if you're investing in health care related stocks or defense related stocks, the two kind of classic ones, right?
Yeah.
It seems sometimes like those stocks should be more sensitive to like actually who would win Congress and not the presidency, right? Because
Yeah, that's definitely
Elizabeth
a
Warren
complexity.
with the Republican Senate probably not going to get Medicare for all, probably not even a public option, right? Elizabeth Warren, a big Democratic wave year where they went up with 54 Senate seats, then, actually, that's a possibility, or something maybe, halfway to that at least. So that's where you probably would want to be focused.
Yeah, it was interesting. In podcast 2, I chatted with Jason Strasser, who's a poker legend who went on to run an options fund, and he was talking about how a big project in 2016 was looking at which sectors would do well in the event of an election, and then comparing it to the implied probabilities in the option markets and taking positions there. So as the election got closer, you could look at not only the relative performance of stocks, but also what options were telling you in terms of the implied probabilities. With betting markets, you mentioned that it is a relatively trivial amount of money at play. There was also in 2012, I think, some fairly well-founded accusations that there was tampering in the betting markets, because if you think about the amount that's spent on campaigns, you have tens of billions of dollars spent on the campaigns, and it takes very little to move the election probabilities in betting markets. And since people are citing them in every article, it might make sense to.
It's relatively cheap, right? And also, if you like, let's say that the real price for Romney should have been 25%, and you bid that up to 40% to create a narrative that's a toss up, right? You're only losing 15% of that bet, right? You're not that mispriced. And so, you take 15% of whatever you spend, and like compared to how much money campaigns spend, then it's not that much money that you're really investing, because the markets aren't that just the volumes aren't that impressive.
Yeah, and there's also the possibility that someone was manipulating that price to bet on the side or something. That sort of thing might happen in elections.
But you do get like a lot of people who are, and I like say this in the like kindest possible way to the listeners of this podcast, right? But like building good election models is hard. So is building good sports models. So is playing poker well, right? But like, there are a lot of dabblers in political prediction that I think probably overestimate their abilities a little bit, especially when those abilities like kind of correlate with what their personal political preferences are, which is kind of a good gut check in the long run. Is if I like, I'm not going to reveal kind of what my personal prices would be on every Democratic candidate, right? But if I have my prices, they're like not very well correlated with who I would actually prefer to see win the election,
Sure.
right? And because you have 17 candidates this time, you could actually kind of have like a sufficient sample to see like, there are people I would love to see do well that I think are not going to come close to winning, and people that I think have a good chance I would not want to vote for personally. So just kind of being aware of that, and whenever you do kind of have a prediction that kind of matches your, I mean, again, I feel like sports fans probably would do a better job of this, right? If you're a New York Knicks fan and you think the Knicks are going to win 43 games when the models say 24 or whatever, then you probably at some level kind of the light clicks on and you're like, oh, okay, maybe I should check myself a little bit. But for some reason, I think people aren't really kind of, I mean, the whole notion of like kind of cognitive bias and all that literature from like behavioral economics for many years, right? It feels like traders and financial markets are reasonably well acquainted with that, right? I don't know about sports bettors. I think probably, like in some ways, sports is so kind of pure and clean and like sort of, you know, a little bit less challenging from a modeling standpoint. Maybe you don't encounter that as much. But in politics, it feels like people are not very well kind of acquainted with you know things as simple as confirmation bias. I mean, half the time if you just like actually like look at an average of polls instead of just one poll, or cherry picking a few polls, even worse, right? Then your kind of baseline story of the election is often way different than kind of what you would read in the New York Times or hear in other podcasts. And like that's the simplest possible mathematical technique is just like to add a bunch of numbers together, then divide them to get an average, right? And even that can actually leave you pretty removed from what the conventional wisdom is about campaigns sometimes.
Well, you were pointing out recently that that Buttigieg has some momentum in the media narrative, and part of it is it seems from the outside perspective that if a poll comes out that shows him doing particularly well, because people want him to do well, they'll isolate that poll and not look at the average.
Yeah, I mean, and we have, you know, typically a typical week, 7 or 8 national polls come out, and so through variance alone, you're going to have polls where he's up 5 points, polls where he's down 3 points, and there's fairly blatant. I don't know if it's conscious or not. That's always a different question, right? But there's kind of fairly blatant cherry picking in terms of which polls tend to get more attention, right? And by the way, it's not just that there's a bias toward particular candidates or toward a particular narrative. It's also that, like there is a bias toward drama, because that's what sells in political news, right? Like you said earlier, you have this kind of long period where not that much happens in campaigns, right? And then it's not like an NBA season where teams play games every second or third day, right? It's all the voting takes place. Although in primary it's a little bit different. Once the voting starts, you do have like 30 different election dates, but you know, there is a very long buildup relative to the actual voting period itself. And so it gets tedious and boring. There has not been that much that's happened in the Democratic campaign this year. And so kind of people literally just kind of halfway make stuff up, right? I mean, like I'm trying to be conscious of my language. I like don't get that quoted like out of context, right? But there is some degree to which like the big purveyors of the conventional wisdom, you know, people kind of on at the Times and the Post and the networks and 538 owned by ABC News, right? There is an extent to which like I mean, I used to work at the Times. There is an extent to which like they're like, well, we are kind of interpreting these events for America and kind of drafting the narrative and what's a clever angle that we can have, and what do people that we talk to, kind of rich donors or Democratic insiders, what do they think, right? And like, you know, I mean, it's kind of like it's a relatively small industry, I guess, is what I'm saying, right? And I've been in rooms literally where like, you know, we're covering a debate and you're in the same, like, usually a college gymnasium is usually what happens. It's held at a college and you're all in like the basketball practice facility or something, right? And you're kind of all watching the debate together on these big screens, and everyone's like on Twitter and kind of, you know, looking over one another's shoulder. So like literally, like you can see the conventional wisdom formulating, and it's not as robust as financial markets where you have many different people coming at it from many different angles. Which is not to say that financial markets don't have all types of problems, I'm sure, but the potential for groupthink is very, very high.
But also, you've set out 538 as trying to be objective about things. Other places have mixed motives and wouldn't necessarily try to deny that. I mean, so no one in the media business, they have to come up with a different story each day, whatever's going to draw the eyeballs. So the poll that stands out, it's not surprising that they might gravitate there.
No, I mean, and they have fairly explicit. You're right. I mean, they, you know, I think in part because elections have always been taken in some ways not that seriously by newsrooms, right? It's kind of like, well, here's where we have fun, and the real work we do is in covering like the White House or covering national security, right? And as a result, the coverage of the White House is way better than coverage of elections. Because kind of seen as, oh, it's kind of fun and games, and maybe we'll dabble at prediction a little bit, and maybe not, and people just want to know kind of what the insiders are saying, and so 538, where, you know, and it's important to say, like, I kind of came into to political forecasting as the kind of third thing that I did, right? Where I built sports models before I ever built political models.
And you were anonymous at first.
Was anonymous at first, right? And I played poker before I ever built political models. And so those are two things that I guess we'll talk about later, but like also kind of train your mathematical intuition in certain ways. And so you come into politics and you're like, okay, actually kind of, I think I know what it means, like actually try to be objective or, you know, I know what it means to like what groupthink is, and I know, you know, how to avoid it. And I thought, you know, when I first founded 538, I thought, boy, political coverage is really quite unsophisticated, or election coverage, I should say. I don't want to like demean all politics coverage, or all news coverage, certainly, but election coverage was not very sophisticated. People would believe in things very firmly that had extremely little evidence behind them, and I think it probably has improved a little bit. But it still leaves a lot to be desired.
But by being anonymous, there was a focus on process. And that's how you gained your initial following, by convincing others of your process. Whereas the biases that maybe newcomers at political prediction might have now could relate to the fact that they're floating their early predictions to social media and getting feedback based on that, which is not ideal for developing process.
Yeah, look, it was a good time in media where like the barriers to entry were relatively low, right? And you could kind of have like thoughtful conversations on your blog, right? You didn't have the kind of quick reaction to things like you do on social media now, and so there was an opportunity to like actually kind of develop what became the 538 model, like almost in like a interactive way with the readers of the blog over the course of the kind of spring and summer in 2008, where you would start out with, I mean, this is probably a basic modeling technique, right? You start out with like kind of a minimum viable product, and then you kind of add wrinkles to it. And so, yeah, the first version of it in 2008 kind of was being built as we went up until, I don't know when, probably by July or so, by the conventions, we had things pretty well locked in. But yeah, it was kind of a unique time, and I think being anonymous was partly like, first of all, I thought like, people don't really want, if you're known for sports, then people don't really want to intermingle sports and politics, which is kind of precedes the whole stick to sports conversation by many years. Turns out that there is like a lot of, I mean, first of all, like there are political events in sports, like, you know, Daryl Morey in China or whatnot, or the NCAA tournament, or the NCAA period, right? And how they treat players and don't pay players, but also like there is overlap between those things. And I wanted to avoid that. But also, yeah, I mean, you know, I inherently get suspicious when someone who has an expertise in one domain, suddenly transfers to a new domain and is treated as kind of like a wizard or whatever. Because I believe that that good prediction requires quite a bit of domain knowledge. And you have to like actually kind of understand the system and be a fan, so to speak, of the system. And so, you know, understand what the rules are. I mean, there's just so many decisions you make when you're building a model, so many kind of conscious and unconscious decisions about like which variables to include or which things when you're debugging something, right? Which things kind of catch your eye as being implausible and wrong, and which things don't. Well, you probably need some intuition about the underlying dynamics based on your awareness of like the history of the system that you're studying or the structure of the system that you're studying. And so, you know, so I didn't want to be like, oh, here's a baseball guy or a sports guy who's now kind of getting into politics. I want to kind of build it out a little bit more on its own, and then there got to be momentum for it, where like they were, you know, I went by the name Poblano, which is a chili pepper, and like I got like reporters from like Newsweek and stuff being like, we want to write about this model, right? And can you like out yourself? I eventually did. but it was anonymous for the first few months at least.
So this election is unique. Speaking of needing some institutional knowledge, this election is unique because of the impeachment proceedings, the incoming
Yeah.
impeachment, and the betting markets currently have that as a 2.5 to 1 favorite to happen. Impeachment. Now, it's not likely that it will be confirmed by the Senate, but it's likely that drama has quite a way to go.
Yeah, I think if anything on impeachment and not removal, I think if anything the markets are priced too low on impeachment. Where what is it, like 75% or something, 2.5? I mean,
I saw that it was a little bit better than a 2.5 to 1 favorite to happen.
Yeah, I mean, so a majority of Democrats, or almost all Democrats, a majority of the overall House, by some margin is on record already as saying we support the impeachment process. Nothing that's happened in the impeachment process would, I think, have made any of those Democrats less likely to support impeachment itself, where public opinion on impeachment has shifted, where Trump's approval rating, people were worried about a backlash, and instead Trump's overall approval rating is maybe down a point or two. He's acting very kind of erratically. Some people might say irrationally. Clearly, from the reporting and from his behavior, Trump does not want impeachment. He does not want to be like a martyr or something. He does not seem to intuitively think it would help him win re-election. And the facts, I think, have been fairly damaging, including based on stuff that the White House itself has released. And so it's hard to imagine, like, given that Democrats you already had a majority for the impeachment process, and given that process has probably been like an 8 out of 10 for them, from the best possible version for Democrats to the worst possible version so far. It's hard to see how they could kind of put the genie back in the bottle and not impeach him at this point, right? Now, I should say those markets, you don't get paid out on impeachment if Trump were to resign before the impeachment process takes place, like Nixon did. And so therefore,
that market
that is like,
is priced at 23% on Betfair, 23% that Trump leaves before the end of the first term, which, as a technical matter, if he dies before the end of the first term, just from being old, like, I don't know what that means.
I think it's a push if he dies. So 20% is that he resigns or is removed from office. Or there's a third way, which is if the 25th Amendment is invoked, you can say the president is not fit for office. He can be removed that way as well.
So that's a fairly high probability, 23%, that he leaves before the end of the first term. And the probability that he is the next president, 41.7%. Then your Warren is at 20%, Biden is at 11.9%, Sanders is at 6.1%. That sort of rounds out the discussion. So does that number for Trump, 41.7%, sound reasonable?
It sounds reasonable, yeah. And I think the 23% sounds reasonable too, right? Look, I don't know how you go about like actually building a model of impeachment. There's like not really a lot of data. If you want to be technical, there have been, depending on how you count, 3 or 4 presidents who have gotten this far with impeachment before. And one of them, Nixon, did resign the office. And so if you want like a very crude prior, then hey, maybe 1 out of 3, 1 out of 4 isn't crazy. That's not that far from where it's priced. Obviously, the big thing that would make removal less likely is that there is a very high degree of partisanship. So far, Republican voters have stuck behind Trump for a near universal degree. Republican members of Congress have mostly stuck behind Trump, although there's been more dissent lately on Syria, to some extent on Ukraine. But you need a fairly conservative Republican senator to vote to remove Trump from office at the risk of a big backlash from the base. To have 2/3 of the Senate vote to remove and convict Trump. So that's a pretty serious threshold. On the other hand, right, the underlying conduct is certainly, I think, compared to like Monica Lewinsky or something, and frankly, as compared to Watergate, in some sense, it's now very similar to Watergate in the sense you're trying to like use questionable means to kind of dig up dirt on one of your opponents, right? It's not that far removed from Watergate necessarily, right? And so the underlying conduct, I think, probably meets the threshold of being impeachable. To me, as a layperson, I'm not a constitutional scholar, right? But it seemed like that would be kind of within a common sense definition of the types of things that the framers would have been worried about. And so I don't know, maybe you kind of default to like naive prior where when this process gets this far, then you never know. And there are also all types of like kind of non-linearities, right? It's not very likely that you're going to have exactly 67 senators vote to remove him, right? Either the dam holds and maybe you have Mitt Romney and Susan Collins and Lamar Alexander, who's retiring, and maybe you'd have, almost all the Democrats plus 3 or 4 Republicans vote to remove him as one equilibrium, right? The other equilibrium is where you have like 85 Republicans vote to, or 85 senators vote to remove him. And McConnell in particular, the Senate Majority Leader, says, you know what, as bad as this is going to be, we need to get my members reelected. By the way, the thing is, if Trump is removed, you still get a GOP president, right? And for a lot of members of Congress, Mike Pence would be a better president than Donald Trump if you're a kind of traditional conservative. So, if Republicans either kind of in a personal way were to say, you know what, I am tired of going on TV and having my legs cut out from under me because the White House's defense strategy is not very good, that I think probably affects people like on a kind of quality of life emotional level. But the more pertinent one is that if they were to conclude at some point that electorally it's better to let go of Trump than to support him, that could flip in a hurry, right? Like, let's say that his approval rating, like right now, we haven't talked about conditional on him being the nominee, what his chances are, right? But probably somewhere in the ballpark of 50-50 is in the ballpark, right? Let's say, though, that 3 months from now, because of impeachment, Trump's approval rating has fallen from 41% or 42%, where it is now, to like 34%. At that point, he might be kind of well and truly fucked in terms of winning re-election. Maybe not quite, because 34% in February doesn't necessarily mean anything about November, right? But there are scenarios where this kind of unfolds badly, and he becomes a big underdog for re-election. Let's say you get to a point where he's more than like a 3-1 underdog or something, right? And also, there's a decent chance that if he loses, it's going to be by a landslide margin, which almost inevitably landslides create problems for every Republican running for Senate and House and governor and mayor and everything else, right? Unless they really, really kind of separate themselves off from Trump. And so there could be an inflection point where things tip in a hurry. Does that mean that like 23% is the right price? I don't know. It's not 50%. I know that much, right? You can always do these gut checks, right? Would I bet even money on Trump not being president by election day next year? No, I would not bet even money on that, right? It's probably not 20-1, right? I would love to bet 20-1 or 10-1 on Trump not being president a year from now. So somewhere between 10% and 40% are like, not crazy estimates. I probably tend toward the lower end of that range, but I don't know.
Wow. All right. That's a news flash.
But people need to recognize that, like, if the whole thing is people underestimate uncertainty, which is, a very, very broad prior to impose on people, but like, it's, if you underestimate uncertainty, then there is downside risk, and downside risk below a certain threshold could trigger Republicans to say, hey, look, it's rational for me now to support removing my president. and trying to cut my loss. Going to get Mike Pence for a year, and then I get, I'll take my chances with the election if I think I was going to be in really bad shape otherwise. And so you're not that far from, I don't know, right? And there are also some things like, let's say that he wouldn't get removed for Ukraine conduct. What if there are other stuff that comes up? What if U.S. policy toward Syria and Turkey was influenced by personal, political, or financial motives for Trump, and that comes out later on, right? The news has unfolded at like a kind of very breakneck pace, and I'm aware that usually things kind of revert to the mean. And if you're listening to this podcast, we're taping it, what is it? It's October 24th or whatever.
Yes.
If you're listening to this on archive in February, it might sound ridiculous because it's like, well, that Ukraine stuff was pretty bad, but all the major revelations were out by November. And then, of course, Democrats voted to remove or impeach him in the House, but didn't get very far in the Senate. And this all seems stupid now, right? But there is this kind of possibility that actually things keep accelerating and getting crazier, right? One mechanism for that is that you have a distressed White House. The people who were the most talented political operatives probably left the White House earlier in the administration, and so you kind of have like anything, right? Like in a military battle, if like the leadership of whatever particular battalion is decimated, and that can create problems down the road, right? And, kind of every time when like one of the quote unquote adults in the room, John Kelly or whomever, would leave the White House, then you would kind of say to yourself, okay, well, sooner or later, this is going to cause problems because you have people who are not really top line professionals working in very, very major jobs in the White House and cabinet positions and everything else, right? And they drink the Kool-Aid a lot with respect to Trump, or they're kind of careerists who are like, Rudy Giuliani or something, who is like cycling through very weird opportunities, going through, weird stuff in his personal life. And I don't know, right? But you're not getting like the top shelf talent in the White House. And that affects both the things that they might, first of all, their ability to like actually prevent Trump from like doing things that are self-destructive. And then the kind of communication strategy later on. I think, through all the reporting I've read, people have given up any hope of kind of really kind of containing and controlling Trump. Where you hear in the kind of first year where, Gary Cohn would like intercept something in his inbox and like tear it up or something, right? You hear these stories about like I don't want to use the term deep state because it's like too flip, right? But you would kind of see more signs of resistance within the bureaucracy to Trump that probably prevented him from doing stupid things, right? Even just saying, hey, look, boss, can you sleep on it? That works sometimes. It's a basic technique of management, right? If I'm doing something at 5:38 and my editors think it's a dumb idea, right? They'll say, let's just, I'm tired. Let's talk about this tomorrow. I'm sure we'll end up supporting, but let's just bring it back tomorrow, right? And then usually you kind of like, you're thinking more clearly the next day and then you don't do something. But those kind of checks and balances, I think are largely kind of removed from the White House.
And we would think that the nature of the discovery process would lead to new things coming out. It's got to be a brutal discovery process that's underway. So you would think that new things are coming out. Now, over the course of these impeachment proceedings, Warren has ascended relative to Biden. Is this because it's quite bad for Biden?
So I don't think she actually has ascended relative to Biden. I think he's ascended relative to everyone else. Where Biden's been fairly steady at around 30% in the polls. He may have lost some steam in Iowa. Actually, one bias I think affects the prediction markets. It's like the fact that so Biden's constituency is older Democrats, moderates, African Americans, non-college Democrats. These are not the most kind of trendy coastal urban elites that the media sometimes hears more from, right? I can guarantee you that there are far more people in newsrooms who would vote for Elizabeth Warren than Joe Biden because they're younger, they're college educated, et cetera, et cetera. She's got a very kind of nerdy, kind of wonky appeal. So as a result, I think like Biden's candidacy has been kind of discounted, even though in some ways it's been fairly resilient in the same way that Trump sort of was in the Republican primaries in 2016. I would still bet against Biden at even money. I think I'd probably, I don't know, I'd probably take Warren over him. I had to get one pick only, but I think it's pretty close. And when you see Warren given double a chance at predicted or whatever is Biden, like, although it's closed a lot as we're taping this in recent days, like that seems like a little bit irrational to me. But it's not because I'm like bearish on Warren per se. It's more that like I think people have it in mind that, hey, it's kind of a long process, and they recall the examples of people kind of coming back and the surprises that occurred in the past. There actually aren't as many kind of big upsets as people think, and they often involve candidates who are in decent but not great position, right?
Like Obama at this stage,
Yeah.
and Buttigieg would seem like a similar candidate in a way.
Yeah, I mean, so Buttigieg and Bernie are the two where, I mean, it's way different to be if you're Bernie at 15% than at 5% or 2%, right? Like Cory Booker or something is. 15% is not great, especially if you're a candidate who got 43% last time and are really well known. But that's within the realm of where candidates have come back from that type of range before and won nominations on multiple occasions, right? With Mayor Pete, he's not doing that well in national polls, but he is at about 15% in Iowa. And if you win Iowa, then okay, it's a game changer. And so those are the, so they're really, I think, like three tiers, right? Tier one is Biden and Warren. Tier two is Bernie and Mayor Pete. I probably have Bernie a little bit ahead, but depends on the importance of Iowa versus national polls. And then tier three is everyone else. So you can probably distinguish between like, all the everyone else's. There are probably some that like are a little bit more viable, Harris or Booker or Klobuchar versus Michael Bennett or something might be in tier four. But I think right now it kind of sorts itself pretty cleanly into those tiers in terms of likelihood of winning the nomination.
So to summarize before we move on to sports, it sounds like selling Trump at 41.7%, buying Biden.
Well, I'm not sure because I haven't weighed in on like the whole conditional on his making the being the nominee, right? I mean, I haven't devoted enough bandwidth to kind of really, really deeply thinking about the general election stuff, right? So I'm probably a hold on most general election related activity.
Fair to say that you're buying Pence at 1.7%?
Probably, yeah. Or Haley. I don't know what Haley's priced at, but yeah, I think there's more than a 1.7% chance that in January 2021 that Mike Pence would be president, that he would be the Republican nominee. And I mean, it's not that crazy, right? Like if there's a 23% chance, I mean, that seems like a very blatant mispricing, in fact, right? If there's a 23% chance that Trump will not be president by election day next year, that means Mike Pence would be, and he presumably would also be like be the nominee, right? And although I think he'd probably be an underdog, maybe a fairly bad underdog in a case where things have gotten so bad that Trump was removed from office or resigned, crazy things happen, and maybe he would have whatever chance. And so that seems like it's definitely mispriced.
And it also sounds like you're short Warren at 20%.
To be president, I think I'm probably short. I'm probably long Biden on the Democrats. I mean, Warren.
So all the random characters you give
I'd probably be short most of the random people. Warren, I think, had been overpriced, but there's been a big correction that occurred over the past couple of days to drive her down to something which is more rational, and she's a pretty good candidate in some ways, right? She does have a lot, you could make a good case for why she would win the nomination. So I don't think I'm actually short Warren necessarily. I think I'm long Biden and short the field, at least as a group.
So to move on to sports analytics and poker, I want to talk about your new basketball model a little bit, Raptor. I don't know why it's named Raptor. I assume it might have to do with your one legal sports bet of last year, as far as I know. Is it true that you only placed one sports bet last year? True or false?
That's true. Yeah.
True.
Um,
And it was
it was actually
a
a
large
series of
bet
bets
by your
on-
standards.
Yeah.
And
By my yeah.
and it was legal in the state of New Jersey.
Went to Hoboken, got a delicious Cuban sandwich, and made various bets related to the Raptors in the NBA finals.
And you believed very strongly in this bet
I believe enough to
based on your projected probabilities versus the market probabilities.
It was based on, and this is so. The version of the model we had last year was a different model called Carmelo, but that had the NBA Finals as a toss up roughly. Whereas the Warriors were like, what were they? They were like minus 230 or something, right? So it was a big disparity.
Even steeper, but I'm
Yeah.
not sure exactly.
But no, this kind of stemmed from like, so obviously whenever you have like a model that is way different than the consensus, then that can be a good way to make money or a good way to lose money, right? You don't automatically go and say, okay, my forecast is radically different than the market price, therefore I'm going to invest whatever percent of my stake in this bet, right? That's like not really a smart idea, right? You want to try to understand why you're priced differently than the market and how much you believe in that. And for the NBA Finals, I mean, I watch a fair amount of basketball, and the Raptors played really freaking well. I mean, they beat Milwaukee, which is a very good team, probably as good a team as Golden State was last year. Kawhi Leonard is a fantastic player. I mean, there was just like a combination of things, right? The Raptors had not really been at full strength for most of the regular season because Kawhi Leonard had undergone load management for 20 games, so not played in 20 games. Kyle Lowry had missed 12 games. Marc Gasol was acquired only 2/3 of the way through the season at the trade deadline when that 5-man Raptor lineup had played in a small sample size, but they were extremely effective, right? So that's one thing, right? And then when you listen to like basketball podcasts that I like, Zach Lowe or whatever, the people who I really trust to like actually understand basketball and have like correct opinions about basketball, like they were saying this series is very competitive. Yeah, Golden State's probably a favorite, but like I could see it going either way. Kind of conversely, when like you would listen to the kind of the next tier down of conversations about the NBA Finals, right? Like I really like the Bill Simmons podcast, right? I like Bill Simmons in general. Was kind of a inspiration for 538 with Grantland, whatever else, right? But if Bill is saying one thing and Zach Lowe is saying the other thing, that's when I might be inclined to like to take the kind of Zach Lowe side of the bet, right? Because I think Bill represents in a very effective way kind of the voice of like the average, very smart sports fan who is not like at a Zach Lowe level. You know what I mean? And kind of believes a lot in narratives, and like the kind of narrative about the Warriors was that, hey, look, Kevin Durant being injured is not as big a problem as you think because they played really well. Actually, I forgot what the record was. Like they had some very high win rate. I think they're like 33-1 or 34-1 in their last like 35 games with Steph Curry playing, but Kevin Durant not playing. Right. And that number, which kept getting quoted over and over, I think is like kind of why people were so bullish on the Warriors, because like that seemed like a really sophisticated point. Right. Sure. On the surface, you might think that these teams are both really good and that the Raptors, by the way, had home court advantage. And that the fact that one of the better players in the NBA is injured for the series, that might tip it toward being a a toss-up, if not favoring Toronto a little bit. But people were kind of like discounting the impact of the Durant injury, I think, for somewhat wrong reasons, right? And the reasons are that like actually like this data about kind of who performs well, which kind of lineup combinations perform well when a guy is on or off the court. I work with that data, and that data is like actually like quite noisy. It does tell you something, but if your prior is that Kevin Durant's a really great player, and then you have lineup-based data that suggests that like he doesn't have as much of an impact as you think, you should really kind of shift away from your prior by like 20 or 25%, right? Which I guess is like very technical, but saying like, a lot of this kind of on-court, off-court data takes literally years to stabilize, right? It's quite noisy in the short term, and so people are kind of like betting on that data in a way that it was weird because like it is like a highly sophisticated argument in some ways, but one that if you're like even more sophisticated, then is like actually not as compelling as you would think. So in some sense, because look, whenever you're making a trade, someone else has to have the other side of the trade, right? So I think kind of like it was like, okay, I think there's like a sophomoric series of arguments for Golden State, and people who are pretty smart but not Zach Lowe, right? Or people who kind of have gotten any advanced stats but like actually never tried to create their own projection system. Those kind of medium sophistication bettors, I think, were mostly on the Warriors, which means there's potential like actually value on the Raptors, right? Because there are people who are smart enough to like think they can make money on the Warriors, but are not looking at not looking at the data in quite the right way.
So, explain the Raptor projection system. I know you're trying to model better each player's individual projection, and I assumed that your Raptors bet had something to do with the fact that the 5 core players on the Raptors were so effective together, and it was more likely in the playoffs that they would be running that rotation closer to optimal lineups. Give us a quick rundown of the Raptor system.
So Raptor stands for all of our sports algorithms are like named after something or someone, right? We had Carmelo, was a previous NBA system. We had Pacoda back in the day, was our baseball system. But Raptor, the acronym stands for Robust Algorithm Using Player Tracking and On-Court, Off-Court Ratings, which is a mouthful, but it says that says a couple of things. One of which is like we are using new data from play-by-play logs and from player tracking data from the NBA. It's all the stuff that's available publicly, but we're using that data that has not been employed before in one of these publicly available metrics, right? So if you hear about like real plus minus or box score plus minus or whatever else, right? Or PER or PIPM, they're basically just using box score stats, so traditional stuff like blocks, steals, rebounds, plus data on lineup combinations, so who's on court and who's off court and how those teams and teammates play together. They're not using the kind of wealth of other data that's now been publicly available for 6 years that the NBA has published or that third-party providers have published.
This data is geographical in nature, or
geographical, like
where people are taking shots and things like this.
So where people are taking shots, kind of who holds the ball for how long, who the nearest defender is on any given shot is an important metric.
So like the Kirk Goldberry type data where it's
which shots are assisted. If you have a bunch of assisted field goals, it means you create less offense for yourself. What types of rebounds do you get, right? If you get a defensive rebound after a missed free throw, well, the defense recovers that ball 90% of the time anyway. It's not that valuable versus a rebound on like a floater or something, actually. That's a fairly high offensive rebound rate, right? So it's like a lot of things that like make a lot of basketball sense, we think. But just kind of no one publicly had been willing to take the effort to kind of incorporate this into I guess you'd call it like a super stat or whatever. And by super stat, I mean so each player gets one rating, actually two ratings, an offensive rating and a defensive rating, which is how many points he contributes to the offense per 100 possessions or contributes to the defense. There are inherently limitations to that approach. So you're kind of saying, okay, I am going to assume each player is an individual and you can mix them together and there are no interaction effects to worry about really, right? That obviously is a big simplification and misses, the classic version is like, what about the interaction between John Stockton or Karl Malone or whatever, right? Aren't they more than some of their parts? Or what about coaching and what about usage and stuff like that? So it's making some simplifications, but it comes a lot closer to actually reflecting how the kind of market of NBA teams values players, right? One thing that comes through in data, at least in Raptor, is that players who create floor spacing, so guys basically who are threats to hit 3-point shots, and therefore attract defenders toward them, well, that means that everyone else is a little bit more open, right? That clearly has quite a bit of value. And so indicators of floor spacing, of passing, tend to be highly valued by Raptor. Because again, if you have access to this new modern data, it just kind of just emerges organically, and that kind of happens to match the way that, at least as I understand it, kind of smart kind of basketball observers watch the NBA today.
Also corresponds with the observed decisions of good coaches, like Spoelstra taking Adebayo as his guy over.
Yeah, so one thing is
Whiteside.
A lot of these other kind of predecessors to Raptor would have to use minutes played as a proxy for things they did not understand about what these guys were doing, right? And that meant that there's big kind of unmeasured quantities involved. With Raptor, Raptor doesn't use minutes played because you get basically 97% of the way there without minutes played, because it actually captures certain types of defensive value, right? It captures, rim defense, for example. Who is the nearest defender? If you're the center, Rudy Gobert or something, then opponents, shoot poorly against you, and you also defend a lot of shots because you're everywhere. You're extremely effective post defender, and that comes through kind of loud and clear in the data. Doesn't mean we capture everything. I mean, I think perimeter defense is still kind of a challenge. I think the NBA is actually working as we speak on new metrics which they're going to debut soon that might be incorporated into Raptor. But we definitely feel like we do a better job of on offense kind of capturing ball movement and shot creation and floor spacing, kind of the modern NBA offense. And then on defense, just kind of going beyond blocks and steals and rebounds, which is all the stats people used to have, and minutes played and fouls. We think we've made considerable improvement in measuring defense. It tends to actually kind of correlate with guys like Gobert and Marcus Smart or whatever, who are regarded as good defenders around the league. It actually kind of matches up with kind of reputational reputations of players quite well.
So since we are under a time constraint, I want to move to the last subject of poker. One of my personal projects is to make your retirement from politics, whenever that occurs, a year on the professional poker tour, because I know you might be inclined to choose that anyway. So after the election for, say, 2021, what are your poker plans? I know you're always involved in learning. You clearly enjoy game theory and its application to poker. So where do you intend to go in terms of learning, and then also in terms of playing?
So I was a limit hold'em donk, or not a donk. I was actually a fairly good, relative to the era, professional for a period from 2004 to 2006. In fact, it enabled me to kind of quit my consulting job. But I would play on Party Poker and Poker Stars, mostly Party Poker. Limit hold'em ranging from 15-30 up to 100-200. Occasionally a little higher, but not consistently. A lot of six-max short-handed games, right? And I made, not spectacular money, but a couple $100,000 over the period of a couple of years. And supported myself primarily that way while I was starting to get into other things like like sports analytics. So once 538 took off, and also kind of online poker was basically banned in the U.S. There are various catastrophic things that happened to it. Right, I actually kind of left pre Black Friday, right? But like, so I have this period. I guess now it's like 13 years ago now, 15 years ago, I was kind of playing poker professionally. Always been an interest of mine. But kind of over the past year or so, kind of my interest has been like rekindled a little bit in a more serious way. And so you probably see me kind of quizzing you about poker hands more often, or kind of playing more. So I was trying like this summer, to kind of get out and play poker roughly once every 4 to 6 weeks, meaning go to like a tournament somewhere, or go to Atlantic City or Philly or some casino on the East Coast and play a little bit of cash. But I spend a lot of time watching poker videos, and I've tried to use solvers. I've tried to I spend a lot of time kind of studying poker. I kind of read poker books, and the like actual playing part of it there's been less. But yeah, the goal is to like play often enough where actually like I'm pretty decent, right? I don't know quite what that means. Like actually it's kind of hard to like say like exactly what your objectives are necessarily. But to be like someone who's actually good, right? Like I'm not going to be world class, given that there are other people who are like as smarter than me and devoting 100% of their lives to poker, and not 10 or 15% or whatever. But I'm pretty studious about it. And trying to like learn. So if you grow up playing online limit cash games in 2005, right? And now you're trying to play live no limit tournaments in 2019, all those things involve like a lot of transitions that you're making, right? I think some of the bad habits that I kind of carry over as a player might be like overly value betting, right? Might kind of be habits that kind of are derived from limit, right? Where you do a lot of value betting and like not a lot of slow playing in limit, right? So that can, I have to be more careful with my value betting in no limit, and also you have to think about what's your checking range in no limit. It's a much more important factor than in limit, right? And so it's kind of like making these adaptations, and I don't know. I have had this year 2 final tables, nothing at any super sexy event, but one at a 1K buy-in at an event at Parks Casino in Philly, and then one at a deep stack tournament at Venetian during the World Series of Poker. So there have been enough kind of like partial successes where I'm like, oh, actually, like I kind of sort of know what I'm doing. But also like, I think now like, if I were like a professional poker player and I was like not at your level, right? If I were like kind of a grinder kind of pro, then I would be kind of like terrified of like all the solvers and all the kind of very strong coaching material you can get nowadays, right? And the sophistication now of like poker strategy, because like that would like take away from my edge. But for someone like me who kind of like is like not dabbling in it, but like, it's probably like the, third or fourth most important focus, where the first 2 kind of dominate everything else, right? At least professionally in terms of politics and sports. Like, if you kind of understand some notion of what a GTO strategy is, both in theory and to some extent in practice, then you're probably a pretty decent player, right? You're not going to have edge necessarily in like a tough, like, 5K 6 max event or something, but you're probably a pretty decent player, and making up for like a lack of like actual experience on the felt by understanding the game theory behind it. And more I've like kind of tried to like say, okay, I actually like, I do just want to play like GTO. For a while I had this theory that like, okay, I'm gonna have like my kind of my default Nate style, and then I can deviate into GTO when it makes sense to against tough players, right? Which didn't really make any sense because number one, GTO is very good. It's not exploitable, right? And it will win plenty of money against like kind of against bad players as well, right? So the notion like I could kind of in my spare time kind of craft like an exploitive strategy where I don't really kind of know the tendencies of the player pool all that well, I think was like a little bit a little bit foolish. So kind of more and more trying to explicitly play GTO and then deviate from it when you have a clear reason to. I mean, certainly if you play in like your average, 1K buy-in tournament at Borgata or at Foxwoods or something. I mean, there are some, to be frank, like awful players there where you should kind of shift and be more exploitative. Um, I mean, like, I don't know. It's like, it feels like this kind of shortcut almost to a lack of at least poker experience in this traditional context or this new context of like no limit tournaments. At the same time, I think if I hadn't played poker, 13 years ago, I wouldn't have the same like kind of card sense that I have. And so, it's a combination of kind of the funny thing is like before when I played, it was all very much by rote. You know what I mean? I would like study hands on 2+2 and talk with people, whatever else, right? But I like never really kind of studied game theory when I played poker before, right? Whole important concepts like, okay, what's your range? Do you have a range advantage given this particular flop or whatever, right? Like it was all derived from just repeat business or repeat play and intuition, right? Like, so one thing I kind of figured out intuitively this is limit hold'em, right? Is like actually like playing suited connectors was valuable in limit more than kind of some of the style guides at the time recommended. In part because of board coverage, which means that like if I have like a lot of 7s and 8s and 6s in my range, for example, then people can't just kind of bluff me on those boards or kind of value bet relentlessly on those boards, right? If I'm only playing high cards and they're defending out of the blind, for example. In fact, because you could also exploit people that way, right? It was kind of like, okay, if I play suited connectors, then either there's a high board and I can represent that hand, and at the time people always assume the pre-flop is ace king, right? Or you actually connect with the board. It's like either way, you had like a way to like derive value from the hand, and so we kind of back into things like the more basic thing is like I played what at the time was considered like a very loose aggressive strategy for limit hold'em, which I think it turns out is like actually like probably pretty close to GTO, if not even like a little bit too conservative. I probably did not defend my blind nearly enough, even though I had a reputation for like being, never folding in my blind and always seeing showdowns. I mean, in limit, because you're often getting like, 12 to 1 in the last street, you should not be folding a lot. Although it's kind of interesting to think about like, okay, when can you bluff in limit? When can you make a thin value bet in limit, right? Every now and then I'll go play limit if there's like a 40-80 game or something. Like it's kind of, to relearn it now is kind of interesting. But I kind of, just through trial and error kind of backed into a style that was considered unconventional at the time, but I think is actually probably pretty optimal.
Well, it strikes me that you have an absolutely perfect skill set for quickly moving to the top rungs of poker. I personally feel like poker is in a process of becoming somewhat boring because it was always inevitable that given the static nature of the game, it was going to yield to analytical methods and computing power. And that's happening at a very rapid clip. The only thing that keeps progress somewhat slow is the fact that computers who are currently playing much better than humans cannot explain why they do what they do. So we have to interpret what they do based on our knowledge of game theory and analytics. But it's clear that the best players going forward are going to be the ones that learn most effectively from computers. And that process is currently advancing at a very rapid clip. And the nature of the process is that the state of knowledge in, say, 2010 is fairly irrelevant. So I see from the outside that your renewed interest in poker has a lot to do with the fact that you see that based on the way the game is evolving, you can jump everyone. Yeah, I truly believe that that's true because huge numbers of hands, huge parts of the knowledge base have become simply irrelevant based on the new things that we've learned from computers. And not only are they irrelevant, but they can slow your progress in the game because let's just say for me personally, where I'm clearly trying to advance along the same lines, you you have to, when you're learning from computers, keep in mind, all right, where are the solutions sensitive and where are they not sensitive, and be most inclined to spend your time studying the situations where they're not sensitive.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
then additionally, let's say they are a little bit sensitive, so the solution is likely to break, or they are somewhat not important from an EV standpoint. Meaning, if you compare the EV of your old lines of play, which are clearly worse than some of the new lines of play that you might be studying, the new lines of play are only a little bit more valuable, but they're much more complicated. Well, that might not be an avenue of study, a productive avenue of study. But there's sort of an advantage that you might have over me, because when I'm making that decision, if I decide, okay, I understand these new lines of play better, these new lines of play that I'm learning from computers, and I think that now the EV is significant enough that I should pursue those lines of play. The problem is that I'm throwing away the entire experience base that I've built with the other line of play. And that's it's a costly and difficult process. Whereas you don't have to make that trade-off. You can just say, all right, I'm going to study the best line of play in this spot and go with it. And then in terms of your focus on GTO play, I think that's absolutely correct. And I was sort of influenced early on by Matt Harvalenko and Limit, who was very much of that philosophy that you should base on GTO, and had pretty strong reasons why you wouldn't want to venture into exploitive territory. And also in No Limit, Ben Solsky, Sauce123, probably the best big bet player of his generation, who had the same philosophy very strongly, that you don't want to deviate from GTO because it creates unnecessary complexity and ultimately costly complexity. And I think that's just more true than ever before. And you just want to base on GTO lines of play. That said, if we look at how a typical tournament goes now, I think basically tournaments now and into the future, you're going to have 70% of the field that is studying advanced material and advancing at a rapid clip and is getting closer and closer to each other in skill level. And then 30% of the field not studying, and their edge is more and more negative. So there's still going to be opportunities for that 70%, but it's going to be somewhat boring to play.
It's felt more and more that, like, it's always been this way. I've just been playing more stuff, but it feels like your table draw is like really important at these tournaments now, right? Because the recreational gamblers are like losing more than ever. When people think people will like kind of Hendon mob their opponents, say what's your kind of lifetime cash is, right? I actually find that sometimes the old school pros, I don't mean like the famous on TV pros, but some kind of grinder pro who's been playing for a while, those are often some of the more desirable people to have at your table, because they will be kind of like, they'll be like you said, they'll have enough of a knowledge base of things that worked before, but they don't have particularly sophisticated understanding of GTO, and they might tilt a little bit also. People are not always playing their best, but yeah, and one thing too is like I found that like when you actually like employ GTO derived strategies, like it often works quite well and it feels pretty good, right? I think it's very important under GTO to have a bluffing range in every spot, but especially since those spots come up so often, it's important to have like a pre-flop bluffing range, right? And so hands with blockers, or sometimes hands that can flop well if you get called a suited connector or whatnot, or a nut flush hand. So like, it plays really well at the tables to like be 3-betting and 4-betting aggressively pre-flop, right? It just kind of plays well. People are kind of terrified of you, and they probably actually overfold a little bit, so it probably also works well as an exploitative play. But against tough opponents too, who are kind of keen to what you're doing, like that's kind of the way that you often want to fight back, right? Your best street if you're someone who is smart but not as experienced like a top percentile pro, right? You often want to get into big pre-flop raising wars for various reasons, including that, like, it's probably the street where they have the least edge relative to you. You get to play pre-flop a lot. If you play poker once a month, right, you play a lot of pre-flop. You don't play that many rivers. And so, it helps a lot pre-flop. Recently been trying to like use more finesse post-flop. I probably have talked to you a lot about kind of almost every hand I feel like I was playing this summer where hands were like, I would make like a big overbet on some street, either for value or a bluff, and it might have been relatively balanced. And the kind of thought was, okay, well, I'm nearly pot committed anyway if I put this amount in, and so I might as well put some pressure on people to fold out marginal to more than marginal made hands, and I'll mix in enough strong hands that like I'm mixed and like not super readable, right? Which is like not a terrible way to play. There can be exploitative contexts where it's pretty good, but it's not how the GTO bots play or the GTO solvers play, especially not in position. Where look, a lot of time when you make a big overbet bluff, for example, you would also have an opportunity to bluff later on in that hand, given certain runouts that are favorable to you. And the bluff might be cheaper and work almost as often. And often, sometimes you have a bad run out and you save money, or you make a hand and you can put money in with the best of it, right? And so, like, preserving flexibility, especially in position, and not giving away too much information is something which the GTO bots seem to prioritize a lot.
Absolutely. And it's interesting the way that fields are evolving, where you have, say, 70% of the people that are studying a lot and working on their games harder than ever before. The level of professionalism in poker has really come to a high level. And then 30% of the field that's not working. You get these really interesting dynamics where I find the most productive way to work on my game is to try to think in terms of GTO, although I'll still slide into exploitive mode. I find when I'm looking at fields and choosing players that I would back, say, in these fields where 30% is somewhat random, just recreational players taking their shot, I tend to favor players who, in my experience, have a GTO base but are quick to slip into exploitive mode when it suits them. Like you had Justin Bonomo having that unbelievable year a couple years ago, and he is really amazing at playing in weak fields because he plays perfectly against tough opposition, and then he just beautifully slips into exploitive mode when it suits. And in particular, if he finds that a table is a little bit weak passive, he will just open up his frequencies to an insane degree, and it really works. He's alert to when to shut it down, like when he's being responded to, and he has a really nice game. Although it's possible that, say, during his really successful year, maybe 40% of the field was strong and 60% was weak, and it worked better than now when you have 70% strong and 30% weak.
I mean, you think it's going to go to like different forms of poker? So like short deck or Omaha or that people spent less time with the solvers on, or does that kind of give even more of an edge to mathematically inclined studious players?
The solvers now have the type of versatility where the solutions are coming quickly in all forms.
Yeah.
So, it's hard to say. Like I put together a Poker After Dark lineup last year where, just to mix things up, we had a huge ante, and that just makes things a little different. I think messing around with the structures like 3 blinds, bigger antes, Or
Bounty tournaments. Played one of those recently. That was fun.
Yeah, never favored those so much, but I think now we have very smart tournaments at the Aria, which is sort of becoming a center of poker. And if you look at, say, their upcoming Poker Master Series, they're having a short deck tournament and having an 8 or 10 game tournament, and then also having big bet mixed game tournament, like 3 big bet games, not no limit or PLO. So I think that kind of variety is probably smart and coming.
Yeah, my intuition is that the poker economy is fairly resilient, and that I think if I had to bet on like the World Series of Poker number of main event entrants in 5 years, I would probably take roughly the status quo. I don't know, right? I mean,
I think the over.
Yeah,
we don't know what's becoming of the World Series of Poker. There are some complexities. It's probably moving locations and stuff like that. But I would say it continues to grow, in part because you have some level of inflation. Like 10,000 is a little bit less than it was 10 years ago, and then
so, yeah.
Poker, although it's somewhat steady in the United States, it's still expanding internationally, and you have a lot of people that are willing to make the trip. So I think that just continues.
Yeah, anecdotally, it seems like you have more players from China in these terms than you used to. More players from Latin America. Obviously, there are countries like Germany where you have a lot of very good poker players, but yeah, no, I mean, so depending on if I ever get my year-long sabbatical, hopefully poker will still be thriving at that time.
I love it. Okay, so we've gone well over time. We have to shut it down. This was amazing. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you, Brandon.